You're a good girl. Hi, everybody. Hey, Covey and I today have a special treat for you. It's one of Covey's favorite rifle cartridges. Do you have a favorite rifle cartridge, Covey? I didn't think so. No, but it is one of mine, and it's one of the best 22 center fires and one of the fastest. And you will be surprised at how old this cartridge is. It's the 22 250 Remington, and this guy traces its lineage clear back to 1915. Stay tuned on this episode of Ron Spomer Outdoors. Well, the 22 250 is my favorite 22 center fire with a twist. But before we get into the depths of the 22 250 and why I like it so much, I got another book for you guys. This one is one you're probably not going to find in the usual bookstores. It's by my old buddy, John Barsness, and it's called Obsessions of a Rifle Loony. John came up with that many years ago, and it means people who are just obsessed about guns and ammo to a crazy degree. You know, the guys who can recite every bullet weight and ballistic number you can imagine for every cartridge ever produced. But John is just an outstanding writer. He knows his material top to bottom, solid research, and he writes beautifully. Any chance you get to read John Barsness, go for it. And I know you can get, I think you can still get this book from John directly. He and his wife have a website called riflesandrecipes.com. So look that up. Eileen does recipe books for game cooking and some great ones as well. So John handles the guns and ammo and she handles the meat and dinner, and it's a pretty good combination. So you might want to check it out. Now, the 22 250 has got quite the history. I mentioned in the start that it goes way back to 1915, and that is when Charles Newton created the 250 3000 Savage cartridge, which looked like this. And that thing was the first U.S. commercial cartridge to go 3,000 feet per second. That was a screamer back in those days. Well, it didn't take long before the wildcatters started fooling around with it, and Gross Venner Watkins and J.E. Gebbe and a Bushnell Smith were playing around with that 250 Savage, necked it down to 22 caliber, and they came up with several variations of it. The most popular was called the 22 Varminter, and that thing was really impressive, doing around 3,700 with a 50 grain bullet, probably 3,600 with a 55 grain bullet. And in that day and age, that's flying. But there was competition, and it stayed a wildcat for a remarkably long time. I have actually got a timeline down here that I worked up for you guys on some of the 22s around in those days and right up to now. And it's really pretty interesting. Now, Winchester in 1935 introduced the 220 Swift, and that was really amazing because it was the first U.S. commercial cartridge to push a bullet over 4,000 feet per second. So we've jumped up 1,000 feet per second from the 250 to that. Now, the Varminter doesn't quite match it, as you can see, not quite as much powder volume in that between those two, but it became more popular. The 220 Swift, I think Winchester stopped making it in the 60s, early 60s. And the 22 250 just kept hanging on as a wildcat. Browning even started making rifles for it before anyone was making ammunition. That was really unusual. Well, it finally did hit the streets. Remington finally grabbed it in 1965, and they called it, obviously, the 22 250 Remington. In its competition at the time, really wasn't the 220 Swift anymore, even though that was a little bit faster. But the 223 Remington, that was kind of an outgrowth of the 222 Remington, which came out in 1950. But the military was looking at it as their new round, and the 222 didn't quite do what they wanted. And then there was the 22 Remington Magnum, which was a little bit longer, and that was actually more powerful than the 223. So this one sort of fits in between them, and that, of course, is probably the most popular 22 these days because it's available in all the AR-15 platforms, as well as bolt actions and single shots and everything else. But of all the ones out there, I think the 22-250 is the hunter's best friend, especially if you like long-range shooting in the open plains where it's often quite windy and your shots are quite long. But what most people are going to ask is, well, 22 caliber, what's it good for? Well, what can you shoot with a 22 other than varmints, foxes, coyotes, and that sort of thing? Well, a lot of folks use it for deer hunting. And I have, and it's quite successful. There were reports way back when of it being a more effective killer than a lot of the bigger calibers. So it's always going to be argued whether that's valid or not. But boy, in my experience, it can more than do the job. And you also hear from a lot of folks, especially in Texas, use the 223 for deer with great results. So if the 223, pushing a 55 grain bullet about 3,250 feet per second, can take care of deer, the 22-250, pushing that same 55 grain bullet 3,600 to 3,700 feet per second, is probably going to do a little better. And, well, the 250 Savage is a cute little cartridge, but it's going to go by the wayside. I don't know that anyone chambers for it anymore. And it's a 25 caliber, not a 22. So really, it is most famous for being the parent cartridge of the 22-250. So you can see when you look at these cartridges and compare them to the 223, how they have more taper. That's kind of an old-fashioned design in the early days because of new powders at the time were a little bit unpredictable and they could get some high pressures, especially on hot days and such. And then extraction became an issue. So a lot of the cartridges then had quite a bit of slope in the body to make sure they didn't stick in the chambers. That's been solved, and these days, straight walls are all the fashion. Now, I mentioned earlier that I like the 22-250 with a twist. And that twist is the Ackley improved version of it. And that deadly looking thing is right here. That is really, I think, the optimum version of the 250-3000 cartridge neck down to 22 caliber. You don't just neck it down. You straighten out those sidewalls and you sharpen the shoulder. Way back when gunsmiths were reporting that a 28-degree slope shoulder on that 22-250 helped burn all the powder in the case and blew less of it down the barrel to burn out the throat, et cetera, et cetera. Well, imagine what that sharper 40-degree shoulder does on that Ackley improved. But a lot of guys will say, yeah, I like that one because you get more velocity out of it. Well, a little bit. When you look at it, it's, I don't know, to me it just looks fast, but really you're only going to get about 2 to maybe 4 grains more powder in this case than this one. And that results in perhaps 100 feet per second more velocity. Not all that much. So the real value in this case lies elsewhere, and we're going to get to that after we look at some of our numbers. Here are some ballistic charts side by side comparing the 22-250 Remington with the Ackley version. And we're shooting the same bullet. This is Hornady's 55 grain VMAX, which I have great luck with, extremely accurate. And the 22-250 drives at 3,700 feet per second. And my hand loads in the 250 AI would add 100. So that one's going to be at 3,800 feet per second. And I'm going to zero them both so that they don't peak more than 2 inches above my point of aim. And that happens at about 150 to 175 yards on these. And as you can see on the charts, at 150 yards, we're just over 2 inches high with the 22-250 and 1.93 inches high with the Ackley version. So close enough. What that means, of course, is that you go quite a ways downrange before you drop too low to hit your target. And if we're talking a coyote, we're looking at maybe 8 inches top to bottom, figure a 4-inch vital zone you want to stay inside of. So 2 inches of drop is going to happen at around 300 yards for both of them. You may be saving a 1/2 inch or a 1/4 inch at most with the Ackley improved. So there's not a huge advantage in it. So why would you bother getting the Ackley improved? You're not going to go down to the store and pick up a box of Federal Ackley improved cartridges for this thing. They just don't load those yet. Someday they might, but boy, they haven't for a long time, and maybe it will never happen. So that means you have to hand load. But if you're a hand loader, here's your advantage. Those straight walls and that sharp shoulder just help this case to not stretch during your reloading process. A sloped case like this with a sloped shoulder, you generally get a lot of neck enlargement. It lengthens as you work it. And then you have to trim it, which is no big deal, except for it's kind of tedious to have to trim those cartridges. I still use a hand trimmer, so I'm in there like, a lot of guys who do high volume will hook up a drill to it and do them rather quickly, but just another step in the hand loading process that you might not want to fuss with. And you don't generally have to. I have friends who can get 7, 8 reloadings out of these Ackley improved cases without ever having to trim them. Personally, I can't remember having trimmed them since my initial round. The other thing that's cool about the Ackley is you can use the same chamber reaming out to the Ackley. So you start with a 22-250 Remington. Your gunsmith can make it into a Ackley improved chamber just by reaming it out a little bit to fit that. And then the actual shoulders are touching at the same datum point. So your headspace remains the same. That means you can safely shoot the original in the new chamber, and it will expand if the brass is any good, and it's usually malleable enough that it expands to fill that chamber. And then you fire formed your brass. And I've even found that fire forming shoots sub-MOA in my rifles with standard 22-250 ammo. So I really don't lose out on anything. I can just shoot the regular stuff until I've got 20 or 40 rounds and then start loading those as the faster 22-250 Ackley improved. Then the last thing that I recommend with the Ackley, and I probably would recommend it with the standard 250 as well, is to get a faster twist barrel. Generally, the twist rates on the 22-250s have been 1 in 14 or 1 in 12. Neither are optimum for today's long streamlined bullets, and you're seeing one right here. I'm currently loading a 75 grain Berger VLD bullet. And as you can see, that thing is going to slip the wind extremely well, and I can get some great downrange performance out of that while keeping my energy levels higher than the 55 grains would do and minimizing my wind deflection. But to do that, I have to have a fast twist. So I had Daryl Holland build me a custom model 700 Remington action rifle, and he spun that baby for a 1 1/8-inch twist. Beautiful stabilization. I shoot sub-MOA with this load all the time, probably between 1/2 inch and 3/4. So it's become a great and effective predator rifle. And I will use that on deer sometimes where legal in different states. And there's quite a few states where it is legal, as is the 22-250. So if you think it's not good enough for deer or antelope, I suggest you might want to try it. Don't have to, obviously. But if you park the right bullet in the right place, they work extremely well. And I've taken some good sized, fully mature bucks with that too. So, and in fact, that one, the biggest one that I can remember taking with it was actually with a 60 grain partition bullet from Nosler, not even the 75 grain. And I've used some 75 grain Swift Sirocco bullets as well with great luck. So yeah, it works. Not everyone's cup of tea, but if you are especially a Westerner and you like to be out in the open country where you might run into all sorts of ground squirrel problems out in the hayfields, and you need long reach and minimized wind deflection, as well as coyote hunting and then some pronghorn and mule deer hunting perhaps, this is a good option. And it's just a fun little rifle and caliber to shoot. So if you're looking for what I consider the best 22 center fires, yeah, you've got a lot to choose from. The 223 Remington remains probably the best one for finding a lot of ammo at good prices and not burning out your barrel because of the volume. It's just not that much powder. You can shoot a lot with that thing. So that's great for targets and high volume shooting. But if you want to reach out and shoot some critters, I would recommend the 250 Remington or its cousin that's still not legitimized as a factory round, but the 22-250 Ackley improved. Works for me, might for you. Hey, this is Ron Spomer. Thanks for watching. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. And again, I thank our patrons on Patreon for supporting us. We really appreciate that. And if you would like to join the Ron Spomer Outdoors Patreon community, just go to patreon.com, Ron Spomer Outdoors, and we'll get you in. Glad to have you. Hunt honest and shoot straight.